Thank you for joining us. I'm Jamie Gass, Director of Pioneer Education. I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. Welcome to our webinar, Civics 2.0, Educating for Self-Government. Before I begin, the powers that be asked me to mention the audience will be muted for the webinar. If you have a question during our discussion, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, which we will review in the Q&A at the end. Quote, "Liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among the people," wrote John Adams, the author of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, the world's oldest functioning written constitution. The framers knew that their experiment in ordered liberty rested on a citizenry that was well educated in the basics of civics, government, and a respect for the rule of law. As products of the Enlightenment, their commitment to reason and constitutionalism was guided by a working knowledge of history. They knew that unlike the republics and empires of the past, the American Republic is not based on tribe, religion, or ethnicity, but established upon timeless principles of law and justice that need to be taught and learned for our country's ideals to be perpetuated. Many heroic teachers and educators, some are with us today, have kept K-12 civic education and the study of history alive, body and soul, in our classrooms. But in contrast to the advice of the framers, civic education for democracy has not been the central focus of K-12 education for the last 30 years. We need to change that. Because now, like Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, who slumbered for decades only to awaken to find himself in an entirely different country, we can see the neglect of history and civics has led to poisonous divisions. Specifically, a rising tide of civic ignorance, tribalism of various kinds, political violence across the spectrum, a decline of religious tolerance, an overt disrespect for the rule of law, and violating others' basic human dignity, property, and civil rights now seem all too commonplace. Whether from our elected officials or misguided citizens, the daily news reflects a serious crisis in self-government. As US history tells us, though, our country has overcome far greater obstacles. We must forever remain optimistic that a more durable commitment to an understanding of the universality of human nature, schooling in our shared civic past, and meaningful citizenship grounded in deliberation is the only rational path out of this current man-made mess. We at Pioneer are proud of our long-standing efforts in support of teaching US history and civics. It has included working with many outstanding teachers, running a student history essay contest, countless research papers, op-eds, and polls, as well as numerous events and podcasts with Pulitzer Prize-winning historians covering every major phase of American history. That said, it is with humility and gratitude that we're seeking advice on what the next phase of our Civics 2.0 work should look like. Our goal is to develop curricular materials in civics that will help teachers, students, and parents alike educate for unifying civic purposes while looking unflinchingly at our past. To that end, we are particularly happy to work with our terrific panelists today, who are among the most thoughtful educators, research, and practitioners in the area of K-12 academic quality and civic education. With us this afternoon, we have Professor E.D. Hirsch Jr., founder of the Core Knowledge Foundation and author of the best-selling books, Cultural Literacy and How to Educate a Citizen, The Power of Shared Knowledge to Unify a Nation. Kelley Brown, a social studies and government teacher at Easthampton High School, former Massachusetts Teacher of the Year, and the driving force behind the We the People Contest's 2020 National Civics Champions. Dr. David Randall, Director of Research at the National Association of Scholars, author of our forthcoming audit of civics offerings across the country. And last but not least, Ian Rowe, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a courageous, dynamic leader from New York City. We are honored to begin with Professor E.D. Hirsch.
Well, thank you indeed. Now, to keep within my 7 minutes, I'm going to read what I wrote, and I'll quickly get into it. I'm grateful to be invited to talk about civics. First, let me mention a news report I saw. Jill Tucker is a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, and she reports the Pledge of Allegiance is now no longer recited in a lot of California schools. And many California youngsters have a notion of what the Pledge of Allegiance is. Last week, a dear friend and distinguished professor who keeps up with the trials and triumphs of our Core Knowledge Foundation, which has a lot of schools now, both red and blue states, told me not to push the idea of patriotism when I talk to people in blue states. Well, I'm equally willing to talk about civics instead of patriotism. Patriotism means devotion to the patria, from Latin pater, father. It means the land of one's fathers. But of course, a lot of us don't have fathers who were Americans. Patriotism is ancestral, it's male, which are two strikes against it. So I'm very willing to replace patriotism with civics, which comes from civitas, which is the Latin word for city. Latin city, by the way, is also the source for civility, for civilization, and it's where all sorts of people from different places jostle up against each other. And so they must learn to be civil. The diverse city is a little America that takes in people from a lot of different places and insists that they must learn good manners, obey the law, share a common language so they can work and play together. And for my 7 minutes, I want to talk about civics in the schools and why our current training of elementary teachers has encouraged a decline in civics and a decline in literacy. I've just finished writing a book about why those two declines in civic commitment and in literacy go together. The decline of civics, the decline of civics in the United States is alarming. Here's a factoid, and one of the reasons is the psyche of the individual child, rather, on citizenship and devotion to the wider society are the chief emphases in our early education. A factoid that I turned up in writing my book was this: two education professors, Sverdlov and Aram, investigated whether there's a difference between what parents want their children to learn in kindergarten and what teachers consider to be the most important things to teach in kindergarten in the United States. Sverdlov and Aram found there's a major difference. Parents want their kindergartners to get a good start in reading and math, but our teachers, because of their training, put reading and math and arithmetic in last place. What's in first place? It's the child's self-esteem, which is already a focus on the self, of course. Behind that finding is the child-centered theory of education. You've heard the motto that a teacher should be a guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. True education is said to be the encouragement of the child's natural processes of development. So it's the child's positive development and not memorization of a lot of factoids that takes first place. The child's development should be natural, like organic foods, not artificial, teacher-led material. The teacher should be a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage, and should encourage the child's self-esteem because research has shown that high self-esteem fosters positive natural development. The mere factoids of literacy and math and civics are secondary to the natural positive development of the child. But recent work in psychology and brain studies have determined that the idea of natural child-centered development is actually scientifically unfounded. And this is pretty new stuff. Current science says there is no inherent pattern of mental development in humans analogous to the child's physical development. According to brain science and current psychology, external social and cultural influences are decisive in a child's mental development. The child's mind is we're talking about young children now, which is my focus. The child's mind is chiefly receptive and is closer to the ideas of the late 17th century English philosopher John Locke than to the modern Swiss philosopher Jean Piaget, who enumerated the child's stages of development. Locke said that the child's mind is largely a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Another metaphor that's used in current brain research is that the child's mind is like a piece of clay ready to be molded. The current brain study calls this cortical plasticity because the human cortex, which is the big part of the brain that makes birth so hard, is metaphorically moldable like clay. That's the very part of the brain where language and schooling and socialization take place. Development of the child comes chiefly from the outside. It doesn't develop on its own like the child's body. So this developmental view and individualistic view is dominant in our schools, and it does not help the cause of civics. The book I chose to check on this was a highly respected one, 600 pages, gone through 8 editions, called Human Development. And a word search of that book shows 97 instances of self-esteem. This is what our teachers are being taught, but 0 instances of civics, allegiance, citizen, patriotism. The authors considered those goals to be different for different societies, which is true enough. But there's very little to say about integration into any particular society. In other words, what I'm saying is that our teacher training is sort of indifferent to the teaching of socialization in the sense of civics and loyalty and allegiance, which is absolutely fundamental and most needed, as John Adams, whom we heard quoted, said, and as everybody in his generation said and knew, the focus on patriotism and in our schools and in allegiance. I read, let me give you an anecdote about this. I read about an 11-year-old in Florida who staunchly refused to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. After all, he said, America has not achieved liberty and justice for all and is not one nation indivisible. And here's where that developmental orientation of teachers broke down. Our teacher called the cops on the grounds that the child was directly breaking a Florida law. But the teacher missed an opportunity of explaining to the child and the whole class that the failures mentioned by the young refusenik should intensify our determination to pledge allegiance to a goal and an ideal that we shall devote ourselves to, that we can't expect the ideal to be handed to us on a silver platter, like the website on an iPhone. We need to go out and do something about it, like becoming a teacher. To refuse to sign on to the cause of improvement is like being a small child who demands candy without doing the household chores. A faith in child development as being automatic and natural has spoiled our schools and it's spoiled our kids. It's a deeply false religion of nature. By chance, I happen to know its origins in European and intellectual history. That used to be my specialty. I had to take a year-long course in Hegel's phenomenology of mind. And I came to understand why John Dewey, who was our chief philosopher of child-centered education, said there remained a permanent Hegelian deposit in his mind. But it turns out that John Locke, and not Hegel, and not Piaget, is more nearly right about the child's mind. That mind needs instruction, not hands-off natural development. It's a blank slate. Children need a sage on the stage. They need the Pledge of Allegiance. Nations have flags. The symbol of commitment to our society is the American flag. Humans need powerful symbols like that. That's why nations have flags. It's a big mistake for any group in our country haughtily to leave the American flag and patriotism to the other party. The last image I saw of Donald Trump, he was complaining in front of a dozen interwoven American flags. Trump's and others' exploitation of the flag has led some Democrats to act like that child in Florida. But it's a tactical and ethical mistake. Idealists must not spurn showing the flag and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. We need to wave it, explain that we strongly favor one nation indivisible, and that we welcome everyone into the Civitas Americanorum, like St. Augustine's Civitas Dei, the city of the Americans. Of course, we strongly celebrate diversity, but to think that diversity is on the same level as liberty, equality, and sisterhood and brotherhood is an ethical mistake and a political mistake too. The Stars and Stripes claim unity in diversity. We do better politically and ethically not to spurn the flag symbolism, as some do now, but to interpret and celebrate it and live up and expand its symbolism and not narrow its basic ideals. Thank you. That's the end of my little contribution.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hirsch. Now, Kelley Brown.
Good afternoon, folks. Thanks for having me. I'm here to speak from my experience as a history and government high school teacher. I've been teaching history and government for the last 21 years. I am not a historian. I am a history teacher. I'm not a policymaker, but I am always a student and always learning. And one of the things I really love about my job. I am here to speak only for myself, although I am going to talk about a program that I use in my classroom that I think is really beneficial to give you a lens to look at civic education. In my own classroom, I use the Center for Civic Education's We the People program, but I just want to be clear that I don't speak for them. So civic education is clearly paramount to any republic. The ancients knew it, the framers knew it, we know it. I thought I might share with you a few elements of my own classroom that help create young citizens that are capable of self-government. To provide some context, the We the People program includes an academically rigorous curriculum about the history and principles of our constitutional republic. The center point of the curriculum is a congressional hearing style assessment throughout the course that I ask students to work in small teams to prepare statements, answering complex questions about the Constitution, after which they engage in a question and answer period with guest judges from the community. Since it began in 1987, over 30 million students and 75,000 educators have participated in the Center for Civic Education's We the People program. So I started teaching this program in 2010. So I've been teaching it for a little over 10 years. And this program creates young people ready for self-government. There are several key elements of this program that accomplish something that I would say is seemingly spectacular. And just to give you an example, we're preparing for a state competition that's going to be happening this weekend. And right before this, I had a very interesting conversation with students that included the following: the counter speech doctrine from Whitney v. California, the marketplace of ideas of John Stuart Mill. We talked about Blackstone's theory about reputation being part of life as a natural right. We talked about compelled speech and really got into all of these really interesting conversations with 17-year-old students who have been working very hard to learn about the Constitution. To me, it's spectacular. I wish it didn't have to be spectacular and it was more commonplace. So here are a few things that I'd like to share with you about this program and what I think makes it a model for us to follow. I think the first is something that connects to some things that Dr. Hirsch was saying, was a rigorous scope and sequence of constitutional history, where students are asked to learn about the Constitution and our government and its institutions, from philosophical influences to modern application. Second, the program focuses on complex inquiry questions and panel discussions requiring students to engage in disciplined thinking and disciplined reasoning. They're forced to see what they don't know and develop strategies for learning and understanding complex material. They write and they rewrite and they create evidence-based, intelligible papers. It's also a learning experience for me. The amount I have learned in the 10 years that I've been working with this program is unbelievable. I do feel like I know a lot and have developed a lot of expertise around constitutional history and law as a result of this. One person from the Center for Civic Education, Bob Lemming, always says that students are victims of what their teachers do not know. And I actually have that hanging over my desk as a reminder to keep learning, and that it's my responsibility to make sure that students know things. A third piece of this program is that civil discourse is central, and this is something incredibly important in my own classroom. Students are taught to treat people with whom they disagree as rational humans. They're required to explore arguments from many sides and learn to answer questions that might feel uncomfortable. They also learn to ask questions that feel uncomfortable. They develop opinions based on evidence and reason, and more importantly, come to respect others with whom they disagree. Our current cancel culture creates a chilling effect for students and adults, so finding ways to have honest conversations is incredibly important. Fourth, students understand the importance of our government institutions and see them as an initial pathway for civic participation. Fifth, monthly, I invite guests into my classroom as judges to engage these constitutional conversations with students. It might be local politicians, it could be lawyers, it may be former teachers, could be folks that I stop and have coffee with sometimes who are interested in talking to young people. And so having this interaction with the community is incredibly important. Each unit assessment helps students learn to talk with adults around issues of self-government and hear intergenerational arguments about government and issues, and it is incredibly important. And then lastly, the program offers an opportunity for students to learn not only about the structures of government, but about civic virtue. And they get to practice that with their peers and in their community. Self-government does start with the self, and to the framing generation, virtues were essential to self-government. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So these are some of the elements that I think are so essential to this program that really can act as a model. And I do a lot of things. I do a lot of trainings for teachers. I'm involved in many things. And this program is by far the most important thing I've ever done and the most important thing that I do. So these elements are incredibly important to me, and I know that other We the People educators do the same, because having participated in the state and national competitions, I get a chance to interact with these young people, and it's incredibly impressive. So I think I'll conclude by sharing maybe a positive trend I'm seeing in civics, something that I'm a little bit concerned about, and then one area that I think we're falling short in civic education. So first, start with the positive. There is relatively amorphous, but I do think there is a significant push for civic education right now across the country. and nearly a universal recognition that we're falling short on training young people for self-government. I think that crosses party lines and goes across everyone. So for example, Massachusetts civic education law requires both civics instruction and it requires students to do 2 civics projects. Additionally, the Massachusetts curriculum framework includes practice standards to be taught at each grade level K to 12 that include both civic knowledge and dispositions, as well as instruction on how to take appropriate civic action. DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Massachusetts, is consistently reaching out to us as educators to offer resources and support. And the 8th grade civics project is directly linked to a required 8th grade civics course, which I think gives promise that students will understand their project within the context of the instruction on government. So I think that's a positive place that we're at. A second place where I'm a little bit more concerned would be about the current approach to civic participation as it goes beyond the classroom. I think it mirrors a frightening trend in our national politics. There is a growing distrust in our government institutions. People are distrusting those institutions, from our elections to our legislatures, our courts, to our schools. To be fair, distrust and fear, big part of the American creed, especially when it comes to power and government. So I'll give you that. But our institutions are fragile and current distrust runs deep. Young people need to be learning about how to engage with and access our institutions first. I think in many civic action programs and materials that are available to teachers, there is more of a protest first approach that is supported, and it emphasizes avenues outside of our institutions. Additionally, I think a lot of the narratives we use to talk about civic change tend to be more glamorous when they're outside of those institutions. I do think activism and protest and civil disobedience and all of these pieces are such a key part to civic participation. But when it comes down to it, institutions are the places where change happens. And I think in order for a constitutional republic to function, the people have to trust those institutions. Recently, I was rereading Brutus I in preparation for our upcoming state competition, and I came across one of my favorite selections. He says, quote, "When a government is to receive its support from the aid of its citizens, it must be so constructed as to have the confidence, respect, and affection of the people. The confidence which the people have in their rulers in a free republic arises from them knowing them, from their being responsible to them for their conduct." Our institutions cannot function without trust, and I think we have a big responsibility as educators to be building that trust, at least in helping students understand them. And then I'm going to end with my poll, what I think we're not teaching enough of in civic education. And I think that's the teaching of virtues and civic virtues. In his treatise on ethics, Aristotle wrote about this concept of telos. Telos is the purpose of every living thing. So for example, like a plant's purpose or its telos is to grow. Because humans are rational, their telos is based on the ability to reason. So what then did Aristotle say the telos of man was? He argued that the telos of man is happiness. He actually calls it eudaimonia, a sort of like contentment. And this is the ability to kind of look back on one's life, content with the choices made and one's impact on society. And his formula for reaching eudaimonia was as follows. He is happy who lives in accordance with complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period, but throughout a complete life. So according to Aristotle and other ancients, to reach human happiness, a person needed to live a virtuous life. So these are things like wisdom and prudence, justice, fortitude, courage, liberality, magnificence, temperance. Anyone who has read Politics or other Aristotelian works knows he was really kind of obsessed with the mean, but that's really what virtues are. They're a middle ground in human behavior. And these virtues were fundamental to the thinking of the framers, and this concept of human happiness as the goal of man constantly finds its ways into the most obscure legal documents, which is a little shocking sometimes. But this idea of eudaimonia and its connection to virtue is something that should be taught in the context of our founding, our Constitution, civic history, and civic participation. So thank you, and I would like to invite Dr. David Randall to share his remarks.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was having a little bit of trouble with my unmuting and unvideoing. Thank you very much to the Pioneer Institute for inviting me, and lovely to hear all my distinguished panelists. I will indeed actually just say my own research, private and away from work, has just been about precisely the connection between eudaimonia and the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's a wonderful intellectual history sequence. I'm here to talk about Learning for Self-Government, a K-12 civics report card. This is a report that I've written for jointly Pioneer and the National Association of Scholars, whom I work for. And it has 3 points, the third of which is what I'm going to focus on for this talk right now. The first is a critique of the various institutions which are forwarding protest civics, as Ms. Brown was identifying, which is unfortunately very deeply rooted in a variety of putatively civics-oriented organizations. So I won't focus on it here, but the 1619 Project curriculum, Educating for American Democracy, Generation Citizen, more weakly, but still, unfortunately, iCivics. All of these are forwarding, action civics, protest civics, vocational training and progressive activism, and calling it civics, and a deeply unfortunate influence on modern civics education. The second part is a sketch of what civics education should be, its principles, the heroes. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson and William Jennings Bryan, Dwight David Eisenhower and Martin Luther King. I think that's rather fun. And indeed, civics to encourage patriotism without apology. The third thing is what I want to focus on here, and that is, in effect, a survey of a number of civics education institutions to tell what is already being done so that people don't have to reinvent the wheel for providing the full range of civics resources. And in my mind, I sort of thought of it as, how should a philanthropist invest for best return on investment in education? And the way I thought of it, there's a bunch of different civics organizations focusing on different things. These ought to be slotted together because they do complement well. Start with teacher training. You have to train the teachers before you can train the students. 2 institutions that are focusing on teacher training very well. The Ashbrook Center is Teaching American History, an online course structure for a master's in American history. And it's interesting. I take them to be sort of soft core conservative in their orientation, but what that means is they simply have a wide variety of good education courses, traditional political history, more modern emphases on women's history and social history, simply a good, thorough, bipartisan education that gets all of the good, solid political, constitutional, intellectual history in there as well. Simply to do good old-fashioned bipartisan teacher training and education is something that's essential for making sure that teachers can teach the students properly. Ashbrook does a good model of that, I believe, and it's linked to, and I'll get back to this, a wonderful series of primary sources on the web. The Jack Martin Center is also supporting a variety of teacher training programs around the nation. They rather intelligently try to make sure that each of these programs is linked to state licensure requirements. Some of these state licensure requirements are unfortunate in what they require, but it is still a good thing to have the best possible teacher training consistent with a state teaching licensure requirement. So training teachers is important. Next, providing entire curricula. It's very helpful for teachers to have available an entire curriculum of civics. Now, the gold standard has just been published, Hillsdale's 1776 curriculum. This was by far the most rigorous curriculum was surveyed in the report. It is 12th grade civics for intelligent 12th graders, and it absolutely qualifies you for undergraduate civics. Heck, it's probably as good as an introductory undergraduate political science course. I mean, and this is not just high school, they have different sequences for elementary school and middle school as well. Deeply rich in primary sources, deeply rich in lesson plans. And the point is, it's in effect a one key, you get everything there. This is the sort of thing that you ought to be investing in, an entire coherent curriculum. And Hillsdale, as I say, does it as well as anybody. And in fact, if you go to their single PDF, you will see. Briefly then, so that a textbook, We the People actually has a rather good textbook. You want to not just have a curriculum, but a core textbook. You want to link to that textbook lesson plan suites, such as that provided by 1776 Unites on Black American History, linked series of lesson plans. You want to have individual lesson plans for teachers to use as they desire. The Bill of Rights Institutes does well by that. You want to have a wealth of primary sources available for students. The Teaching American History that does that, so does the Gilder Lehrman Center. And then above all, you need to have state standards which make it possible for schools to use all of these things together. I would say Florida's draft civic standards are now gold standard for the nation. So what do you need? You need all of these curricular materials, and you need a supportive state in regulatory environment. And I am going to stop here. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it on to Ian Rowe.
Thank you, Dr. Randall, and thank you to the Pioneer Institute for really an extraordinary conversation, and to one of my heroes, Professor Hirsch. Really great to see you. I was introduced as a senior fellow from the American Enterprise Institute, but for the purpose of this conversation, I think my identity as an educator is probably most relevant. Dr. Brown, you'll be happy to know that I'm founding a new network of virtues-based international baccalaureate high schools this year, with the first campus to open in the Bronx in 2022. So the virtues of courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance will be at the heart of every aspect of the school. So I was excited to hear your endorsement of that, unfortunately, unique approach to schooling. For the last 10 years, I was the CEO of a nonprofit network of public charter elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our faculty had the responsibility to educate more than 2,000 students, primarily low-income Black and Hispanic kids, and we had nearly 5,000 families on our wait list, just simply desperate for their kids to receive a high-quality education. And there's no question that our parents understood parts of our country's history focused on racial discrimination. Certainly our parents may have faced racial discrimination in their own lives and feared that their children might as well. But they know that a great education can make a huge difference, a great civics education. They did not believe that their children were doomed to be shackled by the horror of America's legacy of slavery. They know that even there might be some closed doors today because of different forms of discrimination. But they also know that because of America's legacy, and this is why it's so important to tell the complete story of America's history, they know that because of America's legacy of excellence and resiliency in the face of oppressive forces, for lots of different people, hundreds of doors are now open. And that there are strategies that young people have at their fingertips that they can use to capitalize on these opportunities. And that's why the principles around family, faith, free enterprise, hard work, entrepreneurship, These are principles and ideas that are so important for young people to know. And these are principles that are worth fighting for. So it's always struck me, then and now, that it's very important that one of the building blocks of agency in young people, the belief that you can control your own destiny, is that they believe they live in a good, if not great, country. A country that is not hostile to their dreams, a country that, even if flawed, is still full of possibilities that will reward you with great works in return for your great work. And the reason this is so important now, and one of my colleagues just mentioned, is that there's a narrative, a self-defeating narrative, that there are structural forces outside of your control that you as a young person simply will be defeated. So, for example, the New York Times 1619 Project takes a whole different vantage point view, that the country wasn't even founded in 1776, that its true founding was 1619, that the country was founded as a slavocracy and not a democracy, that the founding ideals themselves were, quote, false when they were written, that the country has an anti-Black racism that runs in the very DNA of the country. Imagine if you were a 12-year-old Black kid living in the South Bronx with aspirations to work hard to achieve the American dream, and this is what you're being told about not only the history of the country, but how this indelible history is restricting your opportunities today. And you're told that repeatedly, that there's nothing that you can do individually to achieve that goal. And imagine if that message is coming from adults who are claiming to advocate on your behalf, your own teachers, that in a sense, it's pointless to even try, because these forces, the very history of the country is rigged against you. And that's what I think it's so important we fight against. And that's why I am part of a group of amazing individuals that formed 1776 Unites at the Woodson Center, and that we came together to not create a sanitized version of American history that only looks at our history through rose-colored glasses, but also we don't want to fight, we don't think it's right that the New York Times 1619 Project created in what, in our view, is a very cherry-picked history of the country, where you only look at the most egregious elements of American society. We've got to tell the whole story, warts and all. So we've actually created lesson plans, as just referred to, that have now been downloaded more than 25,000 times by teachers in all 50 states in every type of school: a traditional district school, charter school, after school, home school, prison ministries, wherever character formation is happening for children. And the idea is to tell the more complete stories of the African-American experience in the United States. So that could mean one of our most popular lessons is about Booker T. Washington and the Rosenwald schools. I'm always stunned at the number of contemporary educators who've never heard of the Rosenwald schools. And here's an instance in the Jim Crow era where education for Black children was severely inferior. And Booker T. Washington had the idea to build a network of amazing schools throughout the South. And he partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who was the CEO of the Sears Company at that time, to build nearly 5,000 schools throughout the American South, focused on Black education. And Black communities contributed to the building of these schools, an incredible story of resiliency and self-determination and empowerment, and incredible academic gains were achieved. And ironically, it was Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that deemed that separate must mean inferior and unequal. That led to the demise of the Rosenwald schools, an amazing story of American history. And yet, this is the kind of content that we think it's very important for young people to learn. So if you're learning, for example, about the Tulsa Massacre, a horrific event in American history, tell the whole story. Talk about the entrepreneurship and wealth that was built, that led up to the forces that led to the massacre, and then also include the rebuild that occurred. History is complex, history is exciting, history is engaging. But once you start to impose a contemporary ideology And so you therefore pick out those elements of civics or history that is in line with your particular narrative. That's when we have the opportunity, or I think the perverse opportunity, to create a very negative version or view of what our young people perceive to be possible in their own lives. And that's one of the reasons that we fight so hard to counter these narratives that we think are so destructive. And let me just close with one of my favorite phrases from de Tocqueville. In America, he said, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults." I've always found that quote inspiring because it suggests, just like our nation, every young person has within them the ability to repair her faults and to be successful. And you have to understand your country, warts and all, our entire history, to know that we have the capacity for greatness and to be better. And that's what we want to inspire in every young person themselves for their own lives. So thank you for this opportunity. And let me hand it over now to Jim Stergios.
Ian, thanks very much. It's great. It's a great way to end. And I love when I have people online who are saying things like history is exciting. It's just wonderful. So thank you to all of you very much for being with us, Professor Hirsch, David, Kelley, Ian, and thanks to all who are a part of the conversation. I'm going to jump right into, we received a number of questions from attendees yesterday. I'm going to summarize a couple of them. And first for Kelley and Ian, if I could, how big of a problem, when I say how big, I mean how widespread of a problem is, let's say, the civics deficit, or if maybe the way you were putting it, Ian, the view that there are restrictions on opportunities. How widespread of a problem is that in our K-12 system currently?
Well, if you look at macro measures such as the National Assessment for Educational Progress that was administered in 2019 on their history exam, it's something close to about 15% of American students have even a basic understanding of American history and civics. So, and this isn't news, unfortunately. These numbers have been low for a very long time. What I think has worsened, though, in the last few years is that there's one thing to not, have adequate historical information being taught. That's a problem. But now the very founding principles themselves are under attack. These ideas that these principles were never true in the first place. That's a very dangerous undertaking. And thankfully, I don't think it's widespread. I mean, unfortunately, in the case of the New York Times 1619 Project, they put great forces behind this ideology. But I think the counter has been very powerful. And so there's something very encouraging, I think. But this idea that the principles themselves, because they have not been attained, the ideals as laid out, because they haven't been achieved, therefore should be diminished and they were never true, is the exact incorrect response. I agree with Professor Hirsch's idea that it's the very fact that the ideals have not yet been achieved, that's why we have to pledge even more to things like the Pledge of Allegiance.
Kelley?
So I'm not sure I can answer it about, how widespread it is. I can say in my own community and working with the We the People program, which is a national program across the entire country, that there tends to be immense support for the program and for students participating in the program all across the country. And it really does build a strong foundation in telling the whole story and really forcing students to learn material and become disciplined about the way that they talk about these things. And so, my community is a small community that I work in, maybe 40,000 people. And it really, I think one of my students said at one point in the newspaper, this is the only class I've ever taken where I feel like the whole community cares about how I'm doing. And so, and really the incredible support and knowledge of this. And when we go to the, retirement community in town and we talk with people, and really there's just an excitement about it, because to hear students talk in intelligible ways and ways that are, like I said, I really think it's about discipline to some extent. I don't think we're very disciplined thinkers, and we're not very good at making sure that what we're saying always is backed in strong evidence. And so I can only speak from my own experience, but being part of this national program, I know that the program actually receives the same type of excitement in all of the communities, which is promising, because there are people in my community who are very diverse in terms of their political views, and they still really embrace the idea that students are becoming are thinking about civil discourse and thinking about multiple arguments. So it's promising to me that this really is embraced in my own district and across the country.
Question for David. David, we have so many questions that came from the audience regarding where do I turn? One from Florida, one from Kentucky, another one from a New England town. We had questions about a variety of specific online sources. You just took a look at a whole bunch of them. Can I ask you, can you just walk us through in terms of online, if I were a parent of a kid in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 5th grade, can you give us a few examples of great resources for parents to turn to?
I am going to say the most important thing then is the primary sources. And I thought that's wonderful seeing the nod from Kelley Brown. Yeah, I mean, that is, teachers should be doing this too, but the lesson plans are in effect directed for teachers in classrooms, but it's ultimately about the primary sources. I do think that Teaching American History's selection is magnificent. I must say, the internet in general, we're awash with wonderful primary sources, but Teaching American History, it's free, it's available, it's extraordinarily rich. It goes from colonial times to the present. They have books as well taken from them. I think I would also, by the way, the Online Library of Liberty out in Indiana. They are brilliant for all sorts of texts having to do with the history of liberty from the ancient world onward. That's also worth looking at. I would just say start with those two and you will have an enormous amount of what you need. And I will just, I'll just give you one more thing. There's a series called English Historical Documents done from the 1950s onwards. They have a separate book also available online in university libraries on American colonial documents. It's extraordinarily thorough for everything up to 1776. And that's, I think, what people nowadays know least about. And it's still, almost half chronologically of our history is colonial America, and it just gets skipped over. If you're lucky, it's Mayflower today, Declaration of Independence tomorrow. That stuff people really ought to know about.
Professor Hirsch, look, your life work has been connecting Americans with a sort of a common inheritance in terms of a curriculum, and also thinking about how we stay together, how we retain balance, even at a time like right now. And I'm wondering, are there 3 big takeaways that we should have around how to make sure we educate this generation to continue what is a great history and a troubling history, but it's our history?
I don't know that I could enumerate it as 1, 2, 3. My reluctant conclusion after half a century of dealing with these things and more is I think things will come more right when our early education is less individual focused. And so many things are decided in those early years. It's not just, as I discovered, it's decided pretty well by the end of elementary school, and certainly by the middle years of high school, how much money you're going to make in your life. But equally, and that's because operationally, if you haven't gotten a good education, a foundational education by that time, you're not as smart effectively in the culture as the people who have had a better education. My focus has been on the early years, therefore, and there is a doctrine that I think if we could only overcome it, would put us more in the right direction. And that is the doctrine of natural development. The idea that the teacher should not be a sage on the stage, but should be a guide on the side and let the child develop naturally. I know the origins of that view. That was my subject, actually, as a graduate student, was intellectual history. And that history has been very destructive of the American experiment, I think, because it's highly individualistic in its focus. And that example I gave of the kindergartner's self-esteem being taught to our teachers as being the most important thing to develop along with their natural history gives them a spoiled brat kind of education. And it needs to be a more communal education. Basically, it turns out from what anthropology is saying and psychology, both the psychology and brain studies, is that as our founder James Madison put it, there is a depravity in human nature, and democracy depends as well as altruism. And democracy depends on altruism more than any other form of government. And so I would turn to the ethical side as well as the political and civic history side to say that I think we need to develop a more allegiance to the tribe, which is fundamental in human education. And I think when we become less individualistic in those early years, because that's when we changed. I mean, everybody, I'm so old that I can tell you how it was in the 30s when I went to school, and in the 20s, before progressive education came along. And it wasn't ideal, but I can say it was useful to put your books in the individual desks. Well, now the young kids at the elementary grades are all sitting around the table looking at each other, and the teacher's a guide on the side, maneuvering around it. There was a huge emphasis on patriotism. And that's it, to think.
Professor Hirsch, I agree with everything you're saying, except one thing, which is that you can't say that you're old, because then my mom's old and she's not old, so don't say that. Kelley, coming back to you with another question. There's been a lot of emphasis, in part by yourself, by other speakers as well, on perhaps an overemphasis on working outside the institutions, sort of more protest, action, civics. Obviously, it's a big part of our history, and it's an important part of our history. And I guess I'm wondering, in the moment when we have a lot of divisions, how hard is it for you to teach AP courses? How hard is it for you to navigate all of that?
So it's not actually very hard. I actually think it's probably less challenging for us who actually teach history and civics than it is maybe for people who are teaching other subjects and feel passionate by these moments. I think my students come in, or they're working with some base knowledge that help them actually navigate the situation. And just to give you a very quick example, we were online when the murder of George Floyd happened. And, my first reaction was there was organizing happening in town. And I called the people that were organizing thing, and I called my police department. And I said, can you please both come in and talk to my students about what's happening and what's going on? And we invited both people in, and I had one student who joined a committee that was with the mayor and the police and everyone else to work and look at what is the policy around use of force and other things in town, and actually go into sort of an institutional view of how to change things. And I think part of it has to do with just the fact that it's sometimes more, we see more of it in the media, right? Nobody watches C-SPAN, at least none of my students do, right? But instead they see so much. And so I think there's something a little bit more glamorous about thinking about it that way, instead of thinking about the unity between the two, right? So institutions worked with the civil rights movement in order to create things that became institutional change. And so I just think it's maybe goes back to something that Dr. Rowe said, and I don't want to co-opt your words for my purpose, but just that there's a whole picture. And sometimes because the institutional pieces get aside, we blame the institutions instead of trying to figure out how to work within those institutions. So I actually think it's easier for me because students actually now seek disciplined knowledge before they make passioned actions. And that's really what I want students to be thinking about. I want them to be passionate, but I want them to direct their passion in the right place in a way that can actually affect change if that's what they want. So it's not that hard for me.
Yep. Lead with knowledge, have passion. It's a great message. Ian, I've just got two more questions, one for Ian and one for David. Ian, one of the things that you've been talking about, and you talked about here earlier a little bit, was the 1619 project. And we do have a really complicated, as you said, a really complicated history, and it's good to teach warts and all the beauty marks as well. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the more constructive ways to teach U.S. history vis-a-vis race, our history with race.
Well, once again, thank you for this opportunity. And I'll go back to a point, teach original documents. One of the things that's, I think, very helpful when you read original documents is that you reduce the tendency to impose sort of contemporary interpretations. You can actually see what were these activists grappling with at the time, right? What we now have as a certain past at one time was an uncertain future. And so you have to see what these issues were real time. Martin Luther King presented at the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation back in the 60s. And in his speech, he said, look, if our nation had done nothing more in its whole history than to create just 2 documents, its contribution to civilization would be imperishable. The first of these documents is the Declaration of Independence, and the other is that which we are here to honor tonight, the Emancipation Proclamation. And here's what he said: all tyrants, past, present, and future, are powerless to bury the truths in these declarations, no matter how extensive their legions, how vast their power, nor how malignant their evil, end quote. Those are very powerful words, and you may not get that if you're only reading interpretations of these documents. So I think a real focus on the originals, I think, would be my recommendation.
Ian, that's fantastic. This is my final question. It goes to you, David. Your organization works on higher ed. What are you doing talking about K-12? No, you work on higher ed, and I guess I would appreciate if you could talk about 2 things. What do you think, if you could talk about the role that universities have played in encouraging or discouraging high quality civics in our country? That'd be number one. The other is, if you're talking to parents, what's your advice to them to help prepare their kids to be good American citizens?
Ooh, everything.
Yeah, you got that one.
I'll start out with so I can try to roll this all together. The National Association of Scholars, which focuses on undergraduate education, cares about the preparation of students to come to college. I mean, if students come to college and they're not ready for college education, it has disastrous effects on college education. And that is unfortunately very widespread. We also care about the effect of undergraduate education and schools of education on K-12 education. It's a
Mm.
cycle. What you learn wrong in undergraduate education then affects what teachers teach to students in K-12 education. So I think that's your first question. Your second one was, what should parents do? Oh, homeschool. No, make history education part of what you do yourself. Take your vacations to Boston, walk the Freedom Trail, go to Atlanta and see the King Museum, go to the battlefields. Now, actually, everything I want to recommend is it's easier in the East Coast because we've got a lot more of I'm from Brooklyn. We've got a lot more of the older historical sites, but you can go along the Lewis and Clark Trail along the Missouri. You can go to Sutter's Mill in California for the gold rush. You can, you can in Oklahoma look at the sites of the horrible civil war within Oklahoma during the Civil War, Indian tribe versus Indian tribe. I believe more bloody actually than the Trail of Tears, terribly undertaught. So go yourself, read children's books yourself, encourage them to talk about history. In effect, care, show that you care about history, learn it yourself, look for the better entertainments about it. Pay attention to your school's education in the school, in the schools, correct stuff that's wrong, and be involved as a parent, in parent teachers associations, in boards of education, being a member, witnessing the, paying attention and trying to make sure policy is correct. Don't just stand back. To be a good citizen and a good parent is also to be a good teacher of your children. They all come together. Your civic duty is to care about your children's education. And I have to talk about it. We have jobs, we have lives, understood. Nevertheless, be active and go out and do everything you can to do the education yourself and to make sure that the education in the schools is as good as it can be.
I'm sure that Kelley would appreciate parents doing more of that, so it's a little bit easier when she receives some of the students. I want to say thank you to all of you. Dr. Hirsch, thank you. Kelley, Ian, David, thank you so much. I just want to close with just a couple of quick thoughts. And it goes to the last question, to what can community organizations, or particularly in particular parents, what they can do. And on the Pioneer Institute website, Jamie Gass, our fantastic Jamie Gass, has put together for parents by subject area and often by grade area, a whole number of resources that they can find online. Many times, most often, primary source they can go and take a look at. But do know that one of our important projects going forward, and I'll close with this, is I am a great believer that there are a lot of people of goodwill who are working in this space, and we have worked in this space for a long time because it does matter. We believe that it's really important for Pioneer to pull together resources, online resources that are center left, center and center right, essentially the middle of the country, to reclaim that area and distribute it in a way that can reach parents and students across the country, because the center needs, as one of our great authors once said, the center needs to hold. So we can have great debates whether they lean more right or left, but the center must hold. We've lost a lot of that. You'll hear much more about that in the coming months, but in the coming weeks, you'll see a piece of research by David Randall, who's with us today, who has taken a look at a number of online resources and kind of given us a good sense of what is high quality and what isn't. Please take a look for that. Thank you very much for your attention this afternoon, for being with us. We look forward to speaking with you soon. Take care.